This video is sponsored by Surfshark Alert. Much has been said about just how much damage has been wrought onto the Star Wars brand during Kathleen Kennedy's tenure as president of Lucasfilm, and for good reason. The only cause for optimism for Star Wars today is Jon Favreau's The Mandalorian, and even that success is somewhat hamstrung by the mixed messaging provided by Kathleen Kennedy's High Republic and all the drama surrounding it. But what of Bob Iger? Bob Chapek may formerly be the CEO of Disney, but Iger remains the real power, and the man Kathleen Kennedy reports to. He had the power to stop everything currently wrong with Star Wars at a much earlier stage, yet he chose not to. Should we really be pointing the finger at him rather than Kathleen Kennedy? That is the topic for this video. We will begin by providing some context, by going through how the acquisition of Lucasfilm in retrospect was always different from the much more successful Pixar and Marvel acquisitions. Then we'll explore the early red flags, what actions Iger took, and if he should have acted on the warning signs before things spun out of control. In other words, a recurring theme here is that of recognizing potential problems before they spiral out of control. That is important in both business and in your personal life. Some curveballs you can prevent from happening in the first place, but there are others where all you can do is act after the fact. Such is the case with data breaches, where an institution or service is hacked and personal data belonging to sometimes hundreds of millions of users is stolen, and oftentimes used for nefarious purposes. Data breaches have happened to everything from banks to Yahoo, to the PlayStation Network and LinkedIn, and even Adult Friend Finder, where everything from credit card numbers to private messages were stolen. There is no way to prevent such third-party data breaches from happening, so if your data has been leaked, it is all the more important to take appropriate action fast. Surfshark Alert, this video's sponsor, can help you out with that. Surfshark Alert is an online tool that detects if your private information, such as email addresses, passwords, credit card numbers, have been leaked or otherwise compromised in a data breach. It's super easy to use. All you have to do is link your email address, credit card number, or SSN to your Surfshark Alert account. Then Surfshark Alert will continuously monitor public sources of leaked data and notify you in real time if your data is compromised and what was compromised, such as revealing your leaked password, so that you can take action and prevent harm before it's done. You can order Surfshark Alert in the link below, and by using the code Midnight's Edge, you will get 75% off the regular list price, plus 3 extra months for free, and a subscription to Surfshark VPN. That in turn will give you additional security features, as well as enable you to bypass geo-blocking restrictions and access 15 international Netflix libraries by simply changing your virtual location. Also, Surfshark Alert offers a 30-day money-back guarantee, so there's no risk in trying it out. And if you already have Surfshark VPN, you can activate Surfshark Alert from your account. With that, let's get back to the people versus Bob Iger. In his book, The Ride of a Lifetime, Lessons Learned from 15 Years as CEO of the Walt Disney Company, Bob Iger details that when he was appointed the new CEO of the Walt Disney Company in 2005, he had 3 specific priorities for Disney: to create branded content, to embrace the changes brought on by technology, and to become a truly global corporation. To further the first of those priorities, to create more branded content, Iger, in part, sought to acquire other companies and add them to the Disney portfolio. There were 3 in particular that he had his sights set on. First, and most urgently, there was Pixar, as Disney's own animation department was in shambles at the time. Next, he wanted Marvel, as Disney already had the market for princesses covered. However, their portfolio was lacking in content with greater appeal towards boys. After having acquired the 2 for $7.4 billion and $4 billion respectively, Iger set his sights on Star Wars and Lucasfilm. However, that would turn out to be a different beast altogether than the other 2. When Disney bought Pixar, the deal included a big group of world-class engineers, seasoned directors, artists, and writers, and a working production infrastructure, as well as 6 movies that were already in various stages of development, the first of which would be released the same year, and all of which were virtually guaranteed billion-dollar movies. Likewise, there came included a creative and managerial team with a proven track record, 3 movies in production, the first of which would be released the next year, followed by 2 movies the year after that. And by simply infusing cash, Disney could up that to 3 movies a year. Nothing like that was the case with Lucasfilm. The technical divisions and animation department were busy, yes, but the movie division was for all intents and purposes dormant. There was nothing in the works for either Star Wars or Indiana Jones, nor was there a production pipeline. There were plenty of talented technical personnel, but there was no creative or managerial teams that could get the ball rolling on anything, even with an infusion of cash. As far as movies were concerned, there was literally nothing outside the Star Wars and Indiana Jones licenses themselves. While Pixar and Marvel already were fully functional production entities with their own unique company cultures and distinctive creative drives, Disney would have to go in and set up everything anew at Lucasfilm, the entire production pipeline from scratch. In retrospect, we can now see why that was a red flag, because that also meant there was no established or proven successful creative or managerial teams in place. At the time, however, Disney's main concern was that this meant a movie was 3 years away from release, which meant Disney were 3 years away from seeing their investment produce any noteworthy revenue. With all of that in mind, the Disney number crunchers arrived at the conclusion that Lucasfilm, with all of its assets, was worth no more than $3.6 to $3.7 billion, and even that was being generous. George Lucas understood the reasoning behind why Lucasfilm wasn't worth as much as Pixar, but less than Marvel was an insult he could not stand for. In order to play ball and close the deal, Bob Iger increased Disney's offer for Lucasfilm to $4.05 billion. This was an acceptable increase from the $4 billion sharp that Disney had shelled out for Marvel, so Lucas agreed, and the deal was announced on October 30th of 2012. From the Disney shareholders' point of view, however, this meant that Iger had made Disney overpay to the tune of nearly $500 million. This in turn only put increased pressure on Iger that Star Wars would have to perform for Disney. Since Lucasfilm had no creative or managerial team in place, one of the first things Bob Iger would have to do was find someone to run it. By this time, the Pixar acquisition was already a roaring success, and time would later prove the Marvel acquisition to be an even greater one. Since Disney overpaid for it, the Lucasfilm acquisition would have to perform as good or even better, and for that to happen, the right person would have to be found to manage Lucasfilm and oversee the creative direction. We do not know if Iger had anyone specific in mind, and if he did, it was a moot point anyway, because George Lucas beat him to it. As part of the deal, Lucas had to be available to consult, but he also had to understand that Disney were the ones ultimately calling the shots after the dotted line was signed. Relinquishing that control was hard for Lucas, since he had ruled Star Wars single-handedly for so long. This may have been the reason that in June of 2012, while the acquisition was in the works but not a done deal yet, George Lucas appointed Kathleen Kennedy to succeed him as Lucasfilm chairman. That way, Kennedy would be included with the acquisition and continue to serve as Lucasfilm chairman even under Disney ownership, where Lucas no doubt hoped she would stick up for and protect his vision in the event that Disney would ever try to muck with it. We may laugh at this notion with the benefit of hindsight, but at the time, she looked like a good candidate, and one it would have been very difficult for Disney to remove. By any metric used within the industry, Kathleen Kennedy appears to be a terrific producer. At the time, she was widely recognized as one of, if not the single most influential and powerful women in the film industry. For more than 3 decades, she had produced countless feature films which are considered classics, masterpieces, or both. She had served on a number of advisory boards. She had been awarded a Grammy Award in recognition for her outstanding support of student filmmaking, a Women in Film Crystal Award, and on top of that, she had been appointed Honorary Commander of the Order of the British Empire for services to film production in the United Kingdom. All of this made her a legend within the industry. The quiet part that few in the industry will even dare to think, let alone say out loud, is that virtually all the success Kathleen Kennedy is associated with can be attributed to her extensive working relationship with some of the greatest directors in the industry, including Steven Spielberg, George Lucas, Robert Zemeckis, Richard Donner, David Fincher, Peter Bogdanovich, and Martin Scorsese. When she's not working with Spielberg, Lucas, Zemeckis, or any of the other names mentioned, Movies like A Far Off Place, A Dangerous Woman, Noises Off, Fandango, and Milk Money are what remains on Kennedy's resume. Speaking of her resume, there was also nothing in it which would indicate that she was ready to run a studio, nor that she had the slightest affection for or even understanding of the Star Wars brand. Disney would have been arguably better off hiring Steven Spielberg or his production partner Frank Marshall, the latter having more experience in the creative end of filmmaking and who happens to be Kathleen Kennedy's husband, as they both had more practical experience with the job Kennedy was hired for at Lucasfilm. Even so, the movie she shares a credit on, her awards, her connections, and her general stature within the industry, and let's not deny it, her gender, was such that her appointment to the head of Lucasfilm was critic-proof. We do not know if Bob Iger agreed with her being placed in charge of Lucasfilm, or if he would rather have placed someone else of his choosing there. Iger's book barely mentions her, which suggests the relationship between them wasn't great when that book saw print in the fall of 2019. What we do know is that Iger took a much more active role in developing The Force Awakens than he ever did with any Pixar or Marvel project. George Lucas wrote an outline for a sequel trilogy, but upon reading it, Bob Iger came to be of the opinion that Lucas's vision wasn't the direction he felt was the right one, so he made the call to ditch it. Normally, it would be the studio head, in this case Kathleen Kennedy, who should have made that call. That Iger was the one who made it suggests that he probably wasn't willing to fully relinquish the driver's seat to Kennedy just yet. To be clear, Kennedy ran Lucasfilm, which he had staffed with ideologues like herself and the predominantly female story group. But on the movie side, the buck stopped with Iger in those early days. It should also be noted that George Lucas's intention for appointing Kennedy in the first place was no doubt that she would stand up for his vision in cases just like this, which she didn't. Instead, she sided with Iger. Iger, Kennedy, and director J.J. Abrams together reworked Lucas's treatment into what would become The Force Awakens, as well as an outline for the sequel trilogy as a whole. While we're on the topic of J.J. Abrams, there are some who have wondered why doesn't he get more blame for the Star Wars sequel trilogy in the end becoming something of a wasted opportunity. As a general thing, we at Midnight's Edge aren't big fans of the movies Mr. Abrams either directed himself or that otherwise came from his production company Bad Robot. However, the thing to keep in mind here is that a big part of why both him and his company have risen to the top of Hollywood is their willingness to play ball with producers and other bill payers. In this case, Bob Iger ultimately calls the shots, with Kathleen Kennedy underneath him in the hierarchy, while J.J. Abrams actually made the movie around their notes. Iger wanted a tonal and structural retread of Episode 4. Kathleen Kennedy wanted it female-centric and the OG cast sidelined, and Abrams made a movie around that. Anything Abrams wanted in there had to be approved by Iger and Kennedy, and if he wanted something they didn't approve of, Abrams didn't put up any fights. Instead, he reworked it into something they did approve of. Abrams is the credited director of the movie, but he was never the driving creative force behind it. He made the movie his employers hired him to make, and he made it exactly as he was ordered to. If he can be blamed for anything, is that he didn't sufficiently challenge Iger and Kennedy about some of their decisions, or facilitate a much stronger, more rigid vision and roadmap for the trilogy as a whole. Production on The Force Awakens was fairly typical for a big-budget blockbuster of that scale, in that it mostly went smooth, apart from Harrison Ford breaking an ankle due to negligence on the Millennium Falcon set. There was a back and forth between the director, the writers, and the producers. There were reshoots and there were pickups. This is probably what Iger expected there to be, and what should be expected for future installments as well. Keep that in mind because it'll be important later on. Regardless of what transpired behind the scenes, the pent-up demand for more Star Wars, the Disney marketing machine, and the general serviceability of the movie itself led to The Force Awakens being a monster hit upon release, with heaps of praise being delivered to everyone involved, especially Kathleen Kennedy, who was the public face of Lucasfilm. We don't know if Bob Iger bought into Kathleen Kennedy's hype, or if all concerns were forgotten after The Force Awakens proved to be a smash hit. But at that point, Iger stepped back from actively participating in the making of Star Wars movies. He would still oversee, just like he did with Marvel and Pixar movies, but Kathleen Kennedy was now firmly in the driver's seat for the movies as well, in addition to every other aspect of Lucasfilm. For the second part of the trilogy, The Last Jedi, Kathleen Kennedy and her story group wanted to take Star Wars in their preferred new direction. A direction in which the Star Wars legacy was to be buried and replaced with their new vision of the franchise. To this end, the vague trilogy outline set forth by Bob Iger, Kennedy, and Abrams was scrapped so that Rian Johnson, who reportedly worked closely with the Lucasfilm story group, could subvert expectations. Let that sink in. After filming the first part of it, Kathleen Kennedy made the call to jettison the outline for the rest of the trilogy, the very same one that Iger had signed off on in favor of The Last Jedi and a movie that was designed specifically to end legacy Star Wars. That is a major red flag right there. While Iger wasn't directly involved in the making of the plans to kill Star Wars of old, he knew them, and worse yet, he signed off on them. No doubt after being assured that audiences would love it and embrace the new, hip, and more diverse Star Wars instead. Likewise, the original plan for Galaxy's Edge was to build it in the image of the original trilogy. This changed when Kennedy convinced Iger that they shouldn't build it in the image of what 50-year-olds remembered Star Wars to be, but in the image of Star Wars to come, which Kennedy argued was what every new generation of fan would flock towards. Again, Iger trusted her judgment. Maybe he was impressed with how little production trouble there was on the set of The Last Jedi and thought Kennedy must really know her stuff. As we established already with The Force Awakens, there had been a back and forth. There had been an exchange of ideas. There were reshoots. Rogue One similarly had reshoots and even a change of director. Like The Force Awakens though, it was a success. On The Last Jedi, there was none of that. No back and forth, no exchange of ideas, no notes, and absolutely no critical questions. There were also no reshoots and no pickups. In fact, everything went smooth. Ironically, that too is a red flag. Marvel has movie production down to a science, and even they in advance book their cast for 2 weeks of reshoots before principal photography even begins, because they know something will always need to be tweaked. But on The Last Jedi, everything was perfect. Apart from Mark Hamill, who was the furthest thing from a diva, who was vocal in his dislike about the direction taken. Another red flag. And of course, there was Carrie Fisher, who sadly passed all too soon. She was poised to have a big role in the next movie, which she obviously would not be able to return for. Even so, Kathleen Kennedy and Rian Johnson didn't want to do any tweaks to The Last Jedi to account for Leia's inevitable absence from Part 9. Another red flag, one they would actually clash with director Colin Trevorrow over. Colin Trevorrow wasn't the only director Kennedy couldn't keep for that matter. Under Kathleen Kennedy's watch, Star Wars has been a revolving door of filmmakers who were hired and later fired, and not always before production had begun. The original directors for Solo, A Star Wars Story, Phil Lord and Chris Miller, were fired after filming nearly the entire movie, leaving Ron Howard to reshoot it all. Even Hollywood started to take note of this. More and even bigger red flags that Iger, by outwardly appearances, ignored. Then, The Last Jedi was released. The Last Jedi marks the spot where all the success indicators started pointing downwards for Star Wars. Its huge box office opening was followed by a sharp drop-off in subsequent weeks. And in its aftermath, toy sales, the Han Solo feature film, and the Galaxy's Edge attraction at Disney resorts all tanked. This was when Bob Iger stepped back into the driver's seat. By then, however, the proverbial Titanic had already hit the iceberg. Disaster had already struck and could no longer be averted. By this time, it was all about the rescue operation. In September of 2018, in a notorious interview with The Hollywood Reporter, Iger addressed Solo bombing and said, "I made the timing decision, and as I look back, I think the mistake I made, I take the blame, was a little too much too fast. You can expect some slowdown, but that doesn't mean we're not going to make films. But I think we're going to be a little bit more careful about volume and timing, and the buck stops here on that." No one seriously believed that Solo's underperformance had anything to do with too many Star Wars movies being released in too short a time. Not with the MCU going from strength to strength with 3 movies a year. But with that one statement, Iger took responsibility and let the world know that he had the final say where Star Wars movies are concerned. Meanwhile, Kathleen Kennedy's contract was renewed completely without fanfare, official announcement, or even a hint of public support from Disney. Instead, Kennedy's camp had to leak her renewal to the entertainment media, as if it were an inside scoop of production trouble. Rumors making the rounds at this time suggested that Iger really didn't want to renew her contract. He only did so in part because no one else wanted the job, not with the extremely troubled Episode 9 still looming over the horizon. Iger is rumored to have offered Kennedy's job to J.J. Abrams, who rejected it. There are also rumors which suggest that it was communicated to Iger that if he were to let Kennedy go before she was ready and willing to go of her own accord, she would burn the castle down on her way out the door, and the Twitterati would unleash their ire upon Disney, the likes of which not even the gods had seen before. We do not know to which extent these rumors are accurate. What we do know is that in the aftermath, Kennedy was stripped of her ability to greenlight new movies and relegated to working on the High Republic initiative, as well as some related series of little consequence. This while Jon Favreau was given MCU-level budgets for his Mandalorian series and its spin-offs. By all accounts, the vision of Jon Favreau and his friends from Marvel represent the future of Star Wars, and in producing it, they are reporting directly to Bob Iger, not Kathleen Kennedy. For her part, Kennedy can review what Favreau is doing. She can also provide notes and recommendations, but Favreau is free to ignore her input entirely, as he doesn't report to her. There is some level of irony here, as Kennedy now has the exact same influence over Favreau's Star Wars as George Lucas does over Kennedy's Star Wars. Despite Jon Favreau having autonomy on The Mandalorian, Kathleen Kennedy formally remains in charge of Lucasfilm. She and her hires oversee the High Republic Publishing Initiative and all Disney Plus series not related to The Mandalorian. In other words, there are two very different brands of Star Wars being developed at the same time, and there are two very different types of messaging being sent to the audience. Under normal circumstances, this would lead to brand confusion and clamped down upon. However, this is a situation that has not only been allowed to persist during both Bob Iger and Bob Chapek's tenures as heads of Disney, but has escalated with the release of the publishing initiative, The High Republic. With the benefit of hindsight, it is clear that mistakes were made. The thing that must ever be kept in mind here is that on Iger's insistence, Disney shelled out nearly $500 million more than their best number crunchers deemed Lucasfilm to be worth. That increased the pressure for that acquisition to perform. From that point of view, Iger's actions and decisions in micromanaging The Force Awakens can be defended, as he had an investment to ensure it had the maximum commercial appeal. And in fairness, it is hard to see how that movie could possibly have done any better than it did from a financial perspective, if not a creative one. But maybe because of the financial success of that movie, Iger got sloppy, or maybe he got overconfident. Maybe he bought into Kathleen Kennedy's hype, or maybe he was accustomed to Pixar and Marvel. On those, he wasn't fully on board with everything the respective studio heads wanted, but they knew what they were doing, and even their more controversial plans had a tendency to work out. Maybe he thought that pattern would repeat itself with Lucasfilm. Maybe that's why when Kathleen Kennedy pitched him The Last Jedi and forever ending legacy Star Wars, he either missed or ignored the red flags and trusted her instincts and signed off on it. Whatever the reason, it was a huge mistake. Even if The Force Awakens marked a strong start, Disney was a long way from breaking even, let alone seeing a return on the Lucasfilm investment, which again they had overpaid for to the tune of $500 million. Iger must have forgotten that, because what he signed off on amounted to buying Star Wars only to shut it down. In light of how well The Last Jedi severed the ties to traditional Star Wars, Disney might as well have started a new Wonder Ray franchise from scratch. While both Pixar and Marvel had pitched some out-there ideas before, those ideas were derived from the need of serving a larger story. When Kennedy wanted to end what Star Wars had been, this was done for ideological purposes, although she probably didn't say that in her pitch. That was nonetheless one of many red flags Iger failed to recognize and act upon, not until it was too late. To his credit, Iger then stepped in and gave Favreau the autonomy and funding he needed to start repairing the damage. But that damage would not have happened, certainly not to the same extent, if Iger had seen and acted upon the warning signs before. While Favreau's The Mandalorian has provided a new hope for Star Wars going forward, the sequel trilogy remains a problem and an open wound to many a fan. There can be no healing until it is removed from canon, and even Favreau's efforts are undercut by the High Republic and the other projects to come from Kathleen Kennedy and the Lucasfilm story group. Star Wars still has a long way to go, and Iger clearly could have handled this better. There is, however, a real-life lesson to be learned from this, namely to see the red flags and avert disaster before it strikes. Or if there's something you can't control, such as third-party data breaches, take swift action so as to prevent damage after the fact. Surfshark Alert, this video's sponsor, can help you out with that. So head on over to the link in the description and use our code MIDNIGHT to get 75% off, plus 3 extra months for free, and Surfshark VPN on top of that. Let us know your thoughts on Iger's past actions where Star Wars is concerned, and what you think he and Bob Chapek should do to right the ship going forward in the comments.